It wears the face of a female bee, gives off her exact perfume, and hides the fact that nothing living is there at all. By the end, you'll see why this disguise is aimed at a bee that, in many places, will never arrive. This is the bee orchid, a small wildflower found on chalk grassland across Europe. One of its petals is not a petal. It is a plump, furred, bee-shaped body with a pale, saddle-shaped mark. To a certain male bee, that shape is a female sitting still, and he lands and tries to mate with it. He gets nothing, and he flies off with 2 clubs of pollen glued to his head, carrying them straight to the next flower. He never finds a female, and he never gets a reward, not a drop of nectar. To us, this looks like a curiosity. To him, it is a mistake he makes again and again. And that is only the surface of what this plant is doing. Peel it back, and the trick gets stranger at every layer. Open any field guide, and the explanation is short. The bee orchid looks like a bee to attract bees. It is called mimicry, and it usually gets filed next to camouflage, a flower dressing up to pull in a pollinator. On the surface, that seems reasonable. Most flowers advertise. They flash color, they lay out landing strips of pattern, they load a cup with nectar, and insects come for the sugar and leave carrying pollen. It is an honest trade. The flower feeds the insect moves the pollen. So the bee orchid, the story goes, is just doing the same thing with a fancier billboard. A picture of a bee instead of a bright petal. And you can see why the shortcut sticks, because the resemblance really is that good. The furred lip has the sheen of an insect's back. There are markings that read as folded wings. From a step away, a bloom can genuinely look like a bee has already landed on the flower. Textbooks tend to stop there, satisfied, as if looking like a bee were the whole answer. But that explanation quietly skips the harder question. A flower that looks like a bee to human eyes is one thing. Getting a real bee to treat it as another bee is something else entirely, and it takes far more than a good picture. And the strangest turn in this whole story, what this orchid does when the bee it is dressed for never shows up, is still several layers down. Here is where the surface starts to crack. The picture is a lure, but it is not what closes the deal. The real trigger is a smell. This orchid, one of a group botanists call Offries, does not just imitate how a female bee looks. It manufactures a chemical copy of how a female bee smells when she is ready to mate. A female releases a specific blend of scent molecules that tells nearby males exactly where she is and what she wants. The orchid brews its own version of that blend from its lip, and to a searching male the two are almost indistinguishable. This is not attraction the way a flower usually attracts. It is sexual deception. The male is not coming for food. He is coming for a mate. When he lands, the fake scent tells him he has found one, and the fuzzy texture of the lip confirms it under his legs. He curls his body against it and tries to copulate. Behavior biologists call pseudocopulation. And because he is trying to mate rather than feed, he presses hard into exactly the spot where the orchid keeps its pollen. 2 sticky packets clamp onto his head. He leaves frustrated, still driven, and carries them to the next fake female. The scent, it turns out, does most of the heavy lifting, and the picture is almost a bonus. But a copied perfume raises a harder problem the plant has to solve. A male bee will mate with this orchid before the real females have even hatched. That timing is not luck, it is the whole trick, and it runs on a narrow calendar. In many bees, the males emerge first, often about 2 weeks ahead of the females, and spend those first days patrolling, searching, primed to respond to the very first female scent they meet. The orchid opens its flowers into exactly that window. So when a male picks up that female perfume, there is no real female around to compare it to, and no competition to correct his mistake. The fake is the only game in town. By the time actual females appear, the orchid has already used the males and moved on. And the deception is not aimed at bees in general. Each of these orchids tends to copy the scent of one particular species, tuning its blend to a single kind of male. That specificity is a feature. A male of the right species reacts strongly, while a male of the wrong species barely notices. It keeps the pollen from being wasted on an insect that will never visit the correct flower next. But locking the whole system onto one exact partner carries a risk the plant cannot control. Here's that risk. A disguise tuned to one exact bee only works where that bee actually lives. And for the bee orchid across much of Northern Europe, including most of Britain, the male it is dressed to seduce is rare or simply absent. The longhorn bees that fall for this scent are largely Mediterranean insects. Push north, and the orchid keeps making its female bee flower, keeps brewing the perfume, keeps offering a body for a male to grip into empty air. No male comes. The lure is perfect and pointed at nobody. Now recall the promise from the start, a disguise aimed at a bee that, in many places, will never arrive. This is that place. And here is the part that quietly breaks the whole story. The bee orchid does not just fail and die out. In these bee-less regions, it pollinates itself. As the flower matures, the slender stalks holding its pollen bend down and forward under their own weight, swinging the pollen packets around until they settle onto the flower's own stigma. The plant fertilizes itself, sets seed, and carries on, no bee required. So the elaborate costume, the copied scent, the offered fake female, all of it is still there, still built by every plant, in places where it does absolutely nothing. It is a seduction performed for an audience that left long ago. Which raises an obvious question: why keep the disguise at all? A male bee leaves this orchid dusted in pollen and nothing else at all. No nectar, no food, no mate. The flower gives back exactly zero, and it does this on purpose. That reframes something we tend to take for granted about flowers. We picture pollination as a fair bargain. The plant feeds the insect carries the pollen, and both sides win. But the bee orchid shows that a flower can skip the payment entirely and simply cheat, exploiting an insect's instincts to move its pollen for free. And it is not a lone oddball. More than 150 species of these deceptive orchids run versions of the same con across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Some copy wasps, some copy flies, some copy specific solitary bees, each tuned to a different dupe. Sexual deception has evolved again and again in this family, which tells you how well cheating actually pays. It also flips how we read a pretty flower. Bright petals and sweet nectar are advertising, yes, but they are also, in a sense, an honest price. The bee orchid is the reminder that not every flower is paying it. So the next time you pass a flower that looks a little too much like an insect, remember that it may not be inviting anyone in. It may be running a con so old that, in some fields, it no longer even needs a victim to keep itself going.